and then everything disappears. In a sense that the body is gone, the sense of self is gone, passage of time is gone, so the moment doesn't feel too long or too short, it simply is. There's no sounds, there's no smells, there's no pain, there's no pleasure. In my case, there were three things. There was a bright light of overwhelming intensity. Some people interpret it as a light at the end of the tunnel, but there was no tunnel, there was just this bright light. And then there was this god-awful terror and ecstasy, this combination of terror and ecstasy. And both lasted, they lasted. There wasn't any duration to this. And so it taught me that self is optional.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today we have the very theme of the podcast title to delve into, the quest to understand the nature of consciousness. So we're going to be discussing mind, self, what kind of substrate might be necessary to allow subjective experience. We'll look at the various philosophical positions on the nature of consciousness and ways to move beyond the seemingly unwinnable argument around the hard problem. We'll talk extended cognition, cellular cognition, how integrated information theory is attempting to quantify consciousness, the origin of meaning, psychedelics and the implications of mystical experiences of non-separation, whether AI will ever become conscious, and the implications of plant intelligence and memory. So there is only one person who can speak about such a wide range of topics this well. One of the most passionate consciousness researchers in the world for over 40 years, physicist and neuroscientist Christof Koch. He's the chief scientist at the Blue Dot Foundation. He's authored and co-authored over 1,000 scientific papers. He's also written 6 books, including The Quest for Consciousness, Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist, and Then I Am Myself, the World, the 3 books we'll be focusing on today. Now, remember, listeners, that all those books, papers, and conversation points are minutely referenced in the show notes. So please feel free to use those to further your research. If you like the show, please subscribe and give us a 5-star review wherever you're listening. It really helps the algorithms get the show in front of like minds. You are my marketing listeners. So please follow the show on your favorite social media. Share it with all your friends to help me boost the signal. Now, I have been wanting to speak to Christof ever since I realized that despite coming from neuroscience, he was so open to phenomena of consciousness that didn't necessarily fit with the traditional reductionist paradigm, instead of just dismissing them. So I can't wait to get into this. So without further ado, let's go. So Christof Koch, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. How are you today?
Thank you very well. Thank you for having me, Freddie.
Well, it's a great honor, Christof. Such a massive name in the field. A great honor for us and for the audience. So Christof, as we've got so much to get through from your extraordinarily wide career, I want to skip my usual first question and get straight on to this interesting move that you made from physics to neuroscience. It's quite a radical shift of field, and yet I imagine that the discipline of physics equipped you quite well for this rigorous study required for the famously elusive problems of consciousness. Tell us about this migration and how it enriched your perspective.
Yeah, so it's not such an uncommon. So there's a whole bunch of physicists that come into or have come historically into neuroscience. The brain, after all, is a physical system. It's a piece of furniture of the universe, like anything else, subject to the same laws, right? There aren't any super natural laws that apply to brains, or in particular to human brains, as some people believe, but not to other objects in the universe. And of course, what neuroscientists do, they measure physical activity, things like particular genes that turn on or off, or in my case, electrical activity, or sometimes magnetic activity. So those are physical things that you can study using physics. Yeah. Now, consciousness is different. Certainly when I got into it 40 years ago, it was still considered a sort of marginal woo-woo topic that you could engage in if you had a Nobel Prize. So Francis Crick, my mentor, who co-discovered the double helical structure of DNA. So he was allowed to think about that, or Jerry Edelman, another famous Nobel laureate, or retired people or mystic or philosophers could think about it, but not serious card-carrying scientists. This has now changed. So now it's an acceptable part. For the most part, it's acceptable that you can study consciousness, although whether you can make a full-time career out of it, that's still very much doubtful.
So before we get on to your new book, Thus I Am Myself, the World, I think we need to get up to speed on more than 40 years of your investigation into this great mystery, drawing also on the work of some of the great players in consciousness studies and their positions, many of them who are your friends and your colleagues. So let's start with your first principles mantra. Take no one's word for it. Why is this important in science, Christof, and even more so when studying consciousness?
Well, so it is the motto of the oldest or second oldest scientific society, the Royal Society of London. Take no one's word from it. What it means that, particularly when you're dealing with consciousness, more than any other subject under the sun, ultimately consciousness is about what philosophers refer to first point of view, how it feels to me, how the world seems like to me, not for you, not for a dog or a cat or a mouse or any other conscious creatures, but so it's this unique first person point of view. And if you study consciousness, then I think in particular, if you're interested in things like other states of consciousness that may not be occur that often during everyday experiences, that I think, yeah, you can read other people's account of it, but ultimately you yourself need to experience what flow is, what particular deep states of meditation are, what psychedelic states are, what mystical states are. Because ultimately, the only way you can truly know is by acquaintance, what philosophers say. Knowledge not by you telling me something. And we know this when we teach our kids. The best teacher is experience. If you yourself experience it, is you directly know.
So your first forays into neuroscience and consciousness studies were, as you mentioned, with molecular biologist, neurophysicist, famous for his part in discovering the DNA helix, Francis Crick. Tell us the story of how you came to work so closely together for such a long time, and what it was about the relationship and his ideas that struck you so deeply and just kept you engaged professionally for so long.
Well, so I encountered him when I was, 24. He was lying on an apple tree at an outing of my PhD advisor, and he, even at the time when he was already in his early 60s and world famous, he was obsessed with details. In science more than anywhere else, the devil's in the details. And he really kept on pushing when he asked me very quickly, what do I do? And, what's my PhD thesis on? I told him it's about modeling single neurons in the brain. He was very interested in it. He asked lots and lots and lots of technical questions. How much? How many ionic channels? What's your input resistance? How many spines are there per micron of dendrite, etc.? And then when I moved from graduate school in Germany to become a postdoc at MIT, I visited him in La Jolla, California, and we both discovered a fondness for thinking about sort of this ultimate, or one of the big ultimate questions, right? What is consciousness? And as I said, at the time, that was considered not something you could deal with as a scientist. It was okay. Philosophers dealt with it professionally. They hadn't, of course, agreed on anything. I mean, it's quite remarkable if you look at the intellectual history of philosophy. There isn't really any idea of progress. It's not that today, from a philosophical point of view, we know more, or there's more accepted knowledge about consciousness than, let's see, the ancient Greeks, Aristotle, Socrates, or Plato. And so we felt it was sort of scandalous that science, who claims to can ultimately understand everything in the universe, would leave out this mystery at the central aspect of my life. Because you got to remember, Freddie, the only way you know about the world, the only way even if you're a scientist, a physicist, the only way you know about things is you look at an oscilloscope, right? So that's perception. You hear somebody talk about the theory of relativity. Well, again, it's mediated through perception. Everything you know about the world, in fact, including up to the biggest question, how do you know you even exist? This is the most famous deduction in Western philosophical thought, cogito ergo sum, by René Descartes. So everything you only know because through consciousness. And so therefore, how can science legitimately claim to study everything when it leaves out the central mystery at the heart of existence? And so then what we did, we said, well, let's forget. I mean, philosophy is interesting. You need to know about it. You should really listen to the questions, not to the answers, because by and large, the answers aren't that satisfying, but to the question that philosophers ask. But ultimately, we think it's partially an empirical, experimental question that ultimately we may be able to solve. Francis Crick was always, hopeful that we could solve it, but it wasn't clear with only experiment. And we choose to focus on what's today called the neural correlates of consciousness. So the footprints of consciousness in your brain or my brain or the brain of experimental animals. In other words, so right now you can hear my voice, right? What are the correlates, or what are the neuronal actors in your, well, we know it's your brain, by the way. Most people throughout most of history thought it's the heart. And you still have in fact, you used early on this cardiac-laden language. You said, well, I want to know what's in your heart. Well, in my heart, there's just a pump. It pumps blood. That's in my heart, I can tell you. It's muscle and blood, right? But what you really mean, I want to know what's in your mind. And the mind, we now know, is not associated with the brain, because we can get a heart transplant and we are still the same. People are still the same person. Their memories are not in the heart. Their valor or their love for someone isn't in the heart. It's in the brain. But the brain is a big object, right? It's roughly 3 pounds. Which bits and pieces of the brain are responsible for which bits and pieces of different experience? So when I say I love you, well, which parts of my brain are really critical, important for that? When I say I see you, or I hear your voice, or I dream of your voice, or I imagine your voice, again, which bits and pieces, where are they? How do they look? Are there particular type of neurons? Are they encoded by particular genes? Do they have a particular type of neural activity? So these are all legitimate questions that one can ask, and people are asking. And everyone who agrees that consciousness is a thing that can be studied, because not all philosophers agree it's a thing that can be studied, right? Dan Dennett most famously thought it wasn't really a valid question. But everyone who agrees that consciousness can be studied using science agrees that there will be some footprints and we can study them. And once we have them, this will then give us power in various ways. It can help us if people have disorders of consciousness. Let's say you have in the extreme case, you have a stroke or heart attack or TBI, a massive traumatic brain injury. You're in the ICU. You're not responsive. Okay, you're lying there for 3 or 4 days. And the assumption is because you don't respond to command, people pinch you, you don't orient towards the source of your pain, people assume you're unconscious. And after a couple of days, both in Europe as well as here, the doctor, the medical team will start talking to the loved ones, to the family. Is this what they would have wanted? And in 80 to 90% of the cases, they withdraw life-critical care and the patient dies. Even now we know that 25%, roughly 1/4 of these patients are consciously, but only covertly. That means they're unable to express, they're unable to communicate at the bedside because the stroke or whatever, the heart attack has damaged. They may not either be able to hear you, or they can't speak to you, or they don't have the cognitive wherewithal to express their thoughts in speech. So once we
Lock-in syndrome, is that
no,
right?
no, it's different from lock-in syndrome. So lock-in syndrome is related, but different too. Lock-in syndrome, the patient is fully conscious. In fact, typically they can move their eyes. And if you look at the brain is normal. So the brain waves, the EEG looks relatively normal. I'm talking about behavioral unresponsive. These used to be also called vegetative state patients. So sometimes they have periods where their eyes are open, sometimes it's closed. But as I said, there's no way to interact with them. And their brain is very irregular. So once we know what the correlates of consciousness is, we can then see, in fact, we're beginning to be in a position to be able to do this. Now we can beginning to see, yeah, that's the signature of consciousness. So I know this patient is conscious, even though they can't talk or they can't otherwise communicate with you at the bedside. So therefore, we should not initiate withdrawal of life-critical care. Once we also know where is visual consciousness, where is auditory consciousness, somatosensory consciousness, pain consciousness, right? Once I know that I can, study, I can interfere much more delicately, deliberately, in the brain of patients who suffer from chronic pain or from other things. Or if I want to build brain-machine interfaces to be able to establish a secure link between the patient and the outside world. So myriad, I can then address a myriad of condition. I can also then, once I have the footprint, I can ask, well, how far do they go back into childhood? Do newborn babies, do they have already the hallmarks of consciousness? They clearly respond. That's not a question. But is it like a zombie, or are they actually conscious there? When does it happen? Is it in the third term? Is it in the second term? And then once we have the correlates, we can also track them in closely related animals like monkeys, cats, dogs, mammals. We're all of a kind. We're all nature's children. Our brains is very similar. Some animals have smaller brains. Some animals like dolphins and whales and elephants have bigger brains than us. But the basic brain, the basic layout, the basic architecture is very, very similar. So I can then track this correlate in other animals, or even in animals that are more distantly related, like a squid or a kohed or something like that. So this might not immediately solve sort of what philosophers refer to as a hard problem, but knowing the footprints of consciousness will be a huge step forward, in our understanding of how the mind and the body are linked.
And Crick was also known for being desperate to solve David Chalmers' now famous hard problem of consciousness. And as a way of introducing, he was
I would disagree, Freddie. He thought, in fact, we wrote an article. David Chalmers wrote an article in Scientific American, and then we were asked to write a reply to it. Well, we argued that his hard problem isn't really a hard problem, but that. Yeah, I think it's a sidetrack.
That's my question, actually, Christof. So if you don't mind, I'll just put it to you, and then you can tell me about it. Because as a way of introducing the whole debate and how you and Giulio Tononi have tried to reframe the problem using integrated information theory, I wondered if you wouldn't mind quickly just giving us an overview of this spectrum of philosophical positions on consciousness and their associated issues, ranging from sort of materialist reduction of consciousness to an epiphenomena of just biological survival held by the majority of neuroscientists, perhaps most famously Antonio Damasio, through substance dualism by the likes of David Chalmers with his hard problem that the qualities and contents of consciousness can't be described directly by brain activity, whilst clearly correlated to it, as you mentioned, right across to analytical idealism of the likes of Bernardo Kastrup, which sees all of these laws of nature and physical objects as being fundamentally mental in nature. Just talk us through, because there are issues at every point of this spectrum, and how the framing of the spectrum, as you and Francis realize, might be part of the reason why we just can't solve this debate.
Well, so sure, I can do that. You just gave a great introduction. But let's not forget that's all metaphysics and philosophy, which is important. I don't denigrate it in the least. But we set out to solve an empirical problem. And it's critical to understand that you can chip away at the problem of consciousness, and you can certainly focus on those questions that will have empirical answers. And most people agree sooner or later. In fact, there's a big paper coming out next month in Nature, the world's most famous science journal, where there was this collaboration that I helped to set up between the two prominent theories of consciousness, integrated information theory and global neuronal workspace, about the footprints of consciousness and the timing of consciousness. And we can talk about that later if you want. So as scientists, we have to ascertain there are many, or in general, a thinker about consciousness, there are many aspects of consciousness that will have an empirical answer. Like the question, is consciousness related to the heart? We now clearly know it's not. Is it related to everything in the brain? No, it's not. Is it just a byproduct of any neural activity? No, it's not. My spinal cord, there's no evidence my spinal cord by itself is conscious or feels like something. It's, of course, necessary for me to move, but it doesn't seem to relate at all to consciousness. Same thing with the liver, the kidney, all the other bodily organs. So there are many questions that have an empirical answer that are not subject to endless or interminable philosophical debates. The central question that may not have an empirical answer sort of concerns metaphysics, right? So if by physics you describe sort of all of sciences, not just physics, but then metaphysics is what are the fundamental underpinnings that we make about the fundamental assumptions that we make about what truly exists. And that really has evolved in Western philosophy, which is the one that I'm truly familiar with. I know less about Buddhism. It really revolves around the two poles that you mentioned, the physical and the mental, the experiential and the physical atoms. So for instance, going all the way back to Democritus, in classical Greece, he said the only thing that exists is atoms and the void. So that's the most radical, succinct expression of what used to be known as materialism, what is sort of now for about 100 years is known as physicalism. The assumption that what truly only exists in a fundamental way is physical stuff. So that's matter, that's energy, that's time, that's space, that's things like information. Everything else is sort of has to somehow arise out of that. So representative democracy, for instance, clearly exists. But, it's sort of, you can explain it arises out of complicated brains, in large societies. So the claim is of physical is that everything, including consciousness, has to arise out of matter and energy and related stuff. So that's materialism. Then there's idealism, as you said, that used to be, the thing in Western thought, particularly in the 18th and early 19th century. Hegel and Schopenhauer, Bishop Berkeley, most prominently, right? They believe that ultimately everything is mental, everything is phenomenal, everything is experiential, everything is consciousness, if you want, including the world. So the world, things like this, a bottle of water, ultimately a manifestation of something mental. Then there are other ways of viewing it, panpsychism. Right, so panpsychism has a very ancient history going, again, all the way back to the Greeks, of course, widespread in other traditions as well, that both things exist, both physical and mental, and every physical thing also has an internal aspect. So every physical thing, including this coin, feels like something. Maybe everyone admits, well, this coin will probably only feel something very, very simple, some feeling of existence, while this thing, the brain, feels vastly more. Then there is sort of classical dualism. So I grew up, in a Catholic family, as a devout Catholic, and so that's classical Christian thought. Although there are many variants, of course, but classical Christian thought is there's the physical, no question. There is the mental, my experience of pain and pleasure and anxiety, no question. But then how are these two linked, right? And so the standard belief, again, comes to us from René Descartes, a so-called Cartesian dualism is, yes, there is this, what he called res cogitans, thinking stuff, that only we have, animals don't have, only we have, and that sort of somehow manages to control the physical stuff that controls my body. And furthermore, of course, most Christians then believe in the fullness of time, this thinking stuff is eternal, and in the fullness time will be, reunited with and with God. If you leave out those religious implications, there's still the belief that there's the physical and the mental, and they're somehow linked. Although how that linkage goes, that's always been the big challenge. How can mere physical stuff? So this is the basic challenge of any materialism that has not been answered. How can physical stuff, atoms moving about in force fields, right? How can that give rise to feeling? Where do feelings come in here? It totally appears completely ad hoc. None of the foundational equations of quantum mechanics or relativity or Newtonian gravity, is there any feelings, is there any love or seeing or dreaming or imagining? How does that come about? And so people have tried over the last 100 years within a Western scientific materialist physicalist framework to explain that, typically by saying, well, consciousness either doesn't exist, to gaslighting us, all of us, into believing that our pain and pleasure don't really exist. Oh yeah, people speak about them, but there is no real thing like pain. I mean, this was most famously Dan Dennett's move. He said, well, of course people talk about pain, but what they really mean that they rub, if they have a toothpaste, that they rub their jaw, they avoid chewing on it, they endlessly talk about it, but there isn't anything like the god-awfulness of pain, the quality of pain. But that hasn't worked. That simply hasn't worked, right? And every new generation of scholars finds themselves back with the problem: how does the tooth pain get into the world? Or my love for my partner, how does that arise out of atoms? So that's been the big challenge.
Well, mentioning feelings, in our discussion, Antonio Damasio was quick to point out that feelings like fear and hunger evolved in the brain long before the frontal cortex responsible for our intellectual computation power that leads to our dominance, which he thinks suggests an evolutionary reason for subjective feelings to have emerged purely to serve homeostasis, basically for the survival of a biological entity. And when I asked him, he said there was no hard problem and that us philosophers should go off and study some science.
So of course,
what's your response to Antonio's argument?
Okay, so it's perfectly possible that consciousness evolved in large systems like us for evolutionary reasons. However, that still doesn't explain how a physical system like my brain generates conscious feelings. I mean, just because, it would be great to have telepathy, right? If I can instantly read your mind, I think evolutionary, that would be pretty powerful for me and my descendant. But just because it's advantageous doesn't mean that nature provides us with telepathy, okay? Same thing with feelings. Well, yeah, feelings may be useful, but how does a brain that, as I said, is subject to the same physics as anything else in the universe, how does it generate feelings? So that doesn't, even though it may have an evolutionary function, that doesn't make the problem of how can materialism give rise to conscious feelings. That doesn't make it disappear. And I totally, by the way, agree with him that consciousness should be dissociated from intelligence. Many people, particularly before the rise of AI, sort of, confuse intelligence and consciousness. They sort of AI and artificial consciousness is the same, or natural intelligence and natural consciousness is the same. They're not. They're very different. And yes, consciousness probably goes back, way before the evolution of big brains like a humanoid.
Now, you often mention that there's also a spectrum of embodied and disembodied states to be accounted for. ranging from experience with no bodily activity, like dreams or paralysis, right through to only bodily activity with no conscious experience, like anesthesia. What's the significance of this range of combinations of embodied and disembodied states for what you call the great divide of being?
Well, I would say so. How do we know about consciousness in others? Okay, it's a big problem. How do I know you're conscious? Now, of course, as any first-year undergraduate can tell you, oh, it's an inference. I don't really know. You could be a zombie. Yes, and logically, this is known as ontological solipsism. It is logically compatible with everything I know about the world, that only I'm conscious and you're not, right? No one else is. And then when I die, the conscious world will disappear. It's true. It'll disappear for me. That's logically possible, but it's extremely unlikely, because I can infer that based on your behavior. If you come to the lab and I put you in a scanner, I'll see a brain fundamentally the same as mine. Given how you talk, given how you respond, it's extremely likely that your brain is subject to the same laws and also gives rise to consciousness, just as my brain does. And we can do the same thing in others. But it becomes much more critical in animals and in patients, as I mentioned earlier. When we want to study consciousness in people, in subjects where it's less clear whether they're conscious. So, for instance, in mice, I, like many other scientists, study the neural basis of consciousness, not only in people, but also in mice. How do we know mice are conscious? They clearly can't tell me. Or I study consciousness in patients who are behavioral unresponsive, following a traumatic brain injury or heart attack or something like that. They're behavioral unresponsive. They're also called vegetative state or behavioral unresponsive state. But we now know that a quarter of these cases are conscious. So there, the point is you can dissociate behavior from consciousness. Okay, so tonight, you and I are going to go to bed at different times. To bed, in particular, early on during the night, you will be in deep sleep. Later on, during the second part of the night, you'll wake up inside your dreaming body, and you don't behave. You don't behave. You're paralyzed. In fact, your body actively paralyzes you during your dream, so you don't act out your dream, right? You don't act out when you fly or when you walk or when you have a violent encounter in your dream, that you don't act that out, right? So there, in this case, is a beautiful dissociation. You're low aroused, you're not moving at all, yet you're highly conscious. Same thing when you're sitting on a cushion and you're meditating. You might sit there for 1 hour and be, in some space, some mental space that you experience without any motion. Or during psychedelics, you may be completely immobile, but travel through space and time and experience God knows what, right? So in all these cases, behavior can be dissociated from consciousness, which makes it much more difficult to study in the lab, because typically I use behavior, including speech, to infer that other subjects, like people, or particular like babies, where I can't talk with them, or fetuses or animals, I have to use other ways of inferring consciousness.
I think it's a very interesting reframing of it, using this embodied, disembodied spectrum rather than a philosophical spectrum. Okay, so another finding of neuroscience is that what we perceive to be a coherent self, with memories, with an identity, agency, which seems to control a single unified body, is in fact more of a complex of interacting bodily and mental functions. And in that sense, the self isn't the real thing, but rather the impression of control for the subjective experiencer. So, Christof, what does this mean for the nature of self, and so for the nature of agency and free will?
Well, so I would say, unlike Buddhists, the self is not an illusion, it's as much an illusion as anything else. If I experience pain, you can say, yeah, that's an illusion, it's just a feeling. But at that point, the pain is more real than anything else. In fact, people in a chronic pain kill themselves because they cannot stand the pain anymore. So the self, in that sense, is not an illusion, is perfectly, is as real as any other experience. But unlike day-to-day experience, there's always the self. even though when I don't think about it explicitly, there's always a self in my head watching out for me. It's always about me, 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 me. Right? And in some people, including some famous politicians, it's expressed all the time everywhere, right? That it's about me, me, me. And but there are states, rare though they may be, and you can certainly train yourself in meditation when you go enter a state of flow, when you do long-term running or climbing or any other aerobic activity, when you're totally lost in coding or in reading a book or in watching a movie, the self can be much more muted. And then you experience the world, you still experience the world, quite different. In fact, most people find it a very positive experience not to always have that self, that little voice in their head that constantly criticizes. Yes, the self itself has many different components. It has memory, it has agency, it has intention, it has autobiographical memory, etc. And they all come together into what we call the self that we know consists of different processes. But it's not an illusion, or it's as much an illusion as anything else in life. But the important thing is you can lose the sense of self, you can lose the experience of self, and you can still be highly conscious. So it turns out if you ask people, what you tell me what consciousness is, many people will instinctively say, well, self-consciousness. But that's really only expressed in adults, in human adults. Little kids aren't that conscious. Animals, they have much less self-consciousness. And as I said, there are many states, like when you're lost in play or in doing some work or in thinking about something, the self is also much reduced. So self-consciousness is just one aspect, although a fairly frequent one, of any conscious experience. It's just one part of the universe of conscious experience.
So
And you
in
can
that,
lose the self, and it can be very beneficial for you. You can lose your sense of self transiently, for shorter, longer times, and it can be a wonderful experience for you.
but what does that mean? As you say, it's a sort of convenient illusion. If we could consider it an illusion because it really is a self only from the point of view of that individual, what does that mean for the reality of agency and free will?
I wanted to make this point to you and raise my right hand. It's
Go
not an
ahead.
illusion, Freddie. It's not an illusion. It's a real thing here. And if you want me, I can raise the other hand. Or if you want, I can, if I just determine I'm not going to raise either the right or the left hand because I want to. It is my will. So it is, in that sense, I can't will myself to fly, clearly. My will, my sense of agency is subject to many, many constraints, many, many more constraints than we think it is. So it's not completely free. But ultimately, yes, as an adult human being, I can think and reflect upon my action, and I can freely choose one course of action over another, albeit less free than most people think. So in that sense, agency exists, and free in the classical libertarian sense, free will does exist. It's not illusion. It doesn't mean that every one of my decisions is free. Clearly, when I'm extremely hungry, I'm much more likely to grab food, right? We all know that depending on how I'm raised and what my social economic status is, etc., what tribe I belong to, I'm more likely to vote for one party than for another party. So there are lots of determinants on my behavior. But about those subset of decisions where I clearly reflect, I see a fork in the road ahead. I can do this or I can do that. And this has certain consequences and that has certain consequences. I think about it and I decide I'm going to do that. That is a freely taken decision.
Okay, well,
It's
thanks for
not
that.
an illusion.
Yeah, thanks for that context, Christof. Now, I think we've got a good overview now that we need to get into your books and onto your work. So I just want to start with your 2012 book, Consciousness: Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist. What is it that makes your particular breed of reductionism romantic?
Well, because when I wrote the book roughly a decade ago, I'm a reductionist in the sense that, like any science, I try to reduce to the extent possible. It's an important caveat. Complex things to their simpler constituents. So this is classic in physics. right? You take something very complex like a brain or like a mole of gas, and you try to reduce it. Well, a mole of gas is actually just a bunch of individual gas molecules interacting, right? Or the brain, well, consists ultimately out of, roughly 140 or 160 billion different types of cells interacting in very complicated ways. Now, it's not clear whether everything is irreducible, is reducible to simpler components. And in fact, the theory that I long favor, the theory of consciousness that I sort of contributed in my own ways, minor ways to it, is integrated information that introduces a precise measure of irreducibility. It's a number that tells you this system, for instance, this coin or this brain or this iPhone, have what's called integrated information and is irreducible or is maybe reducible, then its integrated information is zero. If it is irreducible, then its integrated information will be a number bigger than zero. The bigger the number, the less the system is reducible to the sum of its parts. So in that sense, I'm a reductionist. I'm also, however, a romantic because I can sort of sense in the contrails of what I see in the universe, namely that it's highly conducive to life and it's highly conducive to the evolution of complex systems that I think go hand in hand with consciousness. We seem to be living in a universe that it seems to evolve to its individual elements, life on this planet, famously, of course, or possible, very likely on other planets, seem to evolve to a state of more and more consciousness. I just find this. I find myself in this universe. I don't really have an explanation for that, but that makes me sort of romantic. To impute meaning to the universe, right? It's definitely a no thing to do within classical science.
Well, that's my next question, actually. You draw on this romanticism to talk about the reality of meaning. And actually, there are quite a lot of scientific theories of meaning, even among serious reductionists. So I imagine that the origin of this deep sense of meaning that we have is in the need to feel safe, to belong, to be useful to the group, which I guess comes from these salience landscapes that we're involved in, right? So from our relation to the things that seem important to us in our particular environment or with our particular tools or in our particular peer group. But we often think that meaning is this sort of completely subjective and quasi-spiritual notion. Can you tell us what you think is the origin of meaning and why it's important to consciousness?
Well, I don't know whether it's I don't know whether it's important to consciousness. Clearly, there is I totally agree with you. Meaning comes associated with the subjective state. When you feel there's a meaning to it, it provides you some sort of succor, some sort of, well, I feel home in the universe type of feeling. But that doesn't negate the deep-seated need, maybe for evolutionary reasons of the sort that you alluded to try to understand the universe and our place in it and how we came about, and to understand whether there's a larger, one of these ultimate questions. I mean, many scientists say, well, these ultimate questions can't be asked. Well, clearly they can be asked. I think they're highly meaningful in that sense. They're meaningful to many people. And I think most people do strive in one way or the other, small or larger, to try to understand, is there meaning, or are we just thrown into this completely random place? I think it's sort of a more metaphysical question, because clearly one suspects there's no way, there's no scientific theory that will directly ascertain, yes, this sense of meaning is true and that sense of meaning is clearly wrong. So I'm not sure this is the question that can be addressed empirically in the fullness of time. It's like many ultimate questions, that doesn't make the question invalid. It just makes it non-empirical accessible, possibly.
And maybe that's where the place of science, the place of art and spirituality and philosophy comes in as very much an extension of where scientism just doesn't hold. And with some things we're just not going to be able to answer using the method. But in this book, you also describe a big part of the last bulk of your work developing integrated information theory with your colleague, Giulia Tononi, she just mentioned, which you believe bypasses some of the issues with this whole spectrum of materialism to idealism that you just described. Now, just to get a quick sense of this extremely non-trivial theory that we could just never hope to cover in a single interview, let's start with one of the premises of IIT, that consciousness is a real phenomena in some way independent of the substrate of the brain because it has causal power. Now, can you explain this idea, Christof, and how in some sense it's the starting point for this tough project of trying to quantify consciousness?
So IIT starts with axioms. It's whether some people love it about IIT, other people dislike it. Unlike most sciences, it makes some very specific assumptions. It makes first an assumption consciousness exists. In fact, it says it is an absolute form of existence. What does IIT mean by that? I know that I'm conscious because I have this knowledge by direct acquaintance. This coin may exist, but it only exists for you and I in a relative sense. It doesn't exist for itself. And ultimately, existence, that true sort of existence, is existence for itself. You exist for yourself. Tonight, when you're going to go to sleep, as I said, early on in the night, you're not going to exist for yourself because there is no one named Freddy, because Freddy doesn't exist anymore for an hour or two during deep sleep. Freddy exists for your sleep partner. They can see your body sleeping there, but you don't. Freddy doesn't exist for himself. And then later on in the night, Freddy wakes up and exists for himself, although dissociated from the world, right, in a REM steam. So there's this fundamental sort of divide among all things in the universe between those things that exist for themselves to a lesser or larger extent that are conscious and those things that don't exist. That's sort of a fundamental starting point, which sort of really makes it more idealist philosophy, because it starts with consciousness. It doesn't. See, most scientific theories start with the brain, let's say. They say the brain is a physical object, and now they try to squeeze the brain very hard to get the juice of consciousness out of it by saying, well, it's got to be 40 hertz. That's what Crick and I did. Or it's got to be the frontal global neuronal workspace, or it's some particular molecule, NMDA synapses, or whatever, right? So you start with the brain or some behavior of the brain, and then you try to go to consciousness. And then there's always this problem, why should this behavior or those neurons or that gene give rise to consciousness? Same thing, by the way, with computational functionalism, which is the dominant belief in tech, in computer science, that everything ultimately is computation. And yes, if you have a system that behaves just like we do, like a large language model, right, in all sorts of ways, then of course it's going to be conscious as well. So IIT takes a very different point of view. IIT takes a point of view, fundamentally what truly exists is consciousness, and only consciousness in this sense. But consciousness has a few properties. It is intrinsic for itself. It doesn't depend on anything else. I'm conscious for myself. It is very specific. This consciousness, whatever it currently is, it's, having this engaging debate with you, or being in pain or in love or whatever else. It is one experience, right? We never have two simultaneous experience. I can see you and I can still feel the chair, pushing back on my behind. So, but that's integrated into this experience. It's definite. There are certain things that are in my experience right now, and the vast universe of things I could be experienced that are outside. And then it's structured. Like, say, when I look at you, there's left, there's right, there's up, there's down, there's black, there's a microphone, there are these letters changing consciousness. So there are these 5 different axioms, and then essentially it says, well, I'm now looking for physical systems in the world. So IIT is not totally idealist. It doesn't assume there is only the mental. It says what primarily exists is the mental, but there's the physical. There's substrate that you can manipulate, like your brain or computers or whatever else. And now I'm looking at each substrate and saying, can this substrate be the substrate for a conscious experience? If it can be, then it has to obey these 5 axioms. And then it uses what measure of existence does it have? Again, the theory, for better or worse, has this very precise assumption about what exists. What exists, to exist, you have to have, this goes back to a comment of Plato in one of his early dialogues, to exist means to exert causal power. If you have no causal power, you don't exist. You exist maybe for other people. I believe in Santa Claus. So, or my kids believe in Santa Claus when they were little. So that belief has some causal power. But Santa Claus itself has no causal power because Santa Claus doesn't exist. But he doesn't exist because he doesn't have causal power. Sorry. So what exists for consciousness is anything that has causal power upon itself. What does it mean by that? It's a very concrete notion. It's a very measurable notion. You take a system like a brain or like a computer chip, and you investigate to what extent the system's current state can determine the next state or can be influenced by its previous state. This is what causal power is. If you have a complete mathematical description of the system, a so-called transition probability matrix, you can then explicitly compute how much causal power this system has. For instance, if it's unable to determine what its next state is because its next state is totally random, because let's say it's in a very hot environment where everything is just determined by thermal fluctuation, then the system has no causal power upon itself. To the extent that it has causal power, it exists. You can measure this. So following the axioms, you can instantiate this, and you can go through the mathematics, and then you can derive this number that I mentioned previously, integrated information. So a system is a whole, is a system that is a substrate for a particular conscious experience. The quantity of the conscious experience is the integrated information, its irreducibility. But that doesn't, of course, explain its quality. Why space feels very different from being in love is very different from being in pain. So that has to be explained by looking at the underlying causal structure and unfolding it, looking the vast complexity of all the subset of these neurons acting onto those neurons, and those 2 neurons acting onto those 7, and those 15 acting onto those 22 over there. And then looking at all the sum, all the combination of all these different causal interactions, that itself, per the central identity of the theory, that it says that what consciousness is. Consciousness is the unfolded causal power. There's a one-to-one mapping, not identity, but mapping. There's a complete mapping between every single intrinsic causal power of a particular network in a particular state and the conscious experience of that network in that state.
So let's take an example. I think a good example is the placebo. The placebo effect is an example of this downward causal effect of consciousness, right?
Yeah, I don't know what you mean in this case by downward. It's an effect where my belief, essentially what placebo is, my belief in the effectiveness of a procedure, whether that's a vaccine or whether it's you having a white lab coat and giving me a piece of a little tablet and say, well, if you take this, you won't have pain anymore, or you won't be depressed anymore, or you'll experience, you'll have this magical experience. The extent to which I believe that will influence my actual experience of that particular procedure, and will influence how I therapeutically respond to it. It's quite remarkable. It's the power of belief that manifests itself in what people often sort of derisively say, well, that's just a placebo effect. But most of medicine, a lot of medicine is probably placebo, and it's a great thing, because if you believe in your doctor and what he or she does, then you're much more likely to be healed. In other words, to not have your symptoms anymore than if you don't believe it.
Could you take the example of the placebo effect just to give us an idea, without getting too technical, of how you calculate the consciousness of that particular system experiencing the placebo effect to get this figure, this thing that you call phi in IIT?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is it scales very badly in the sense that if you look at even 10 elements, let's say 10 binary neurons that could be on or off, or binary transistors, doesn't matter, or logical gates, and you try to explicitly compute phi, which you can do for very small numbers like 10, you already arrive at a vast complexity of hundreds of thousands possible substrate, because there is, for example, a combination of these two neurons on influencing those 8 neurons, and those 3 neurons influencing 2 neurons over here and 5 neurons over there, and those 7 neurons influencing those 3 neurons there. And you have to look at the subset of all those. So it scales as by 2 to the 2 to the n. So for n equals 10, that's 2 to the 2 to the 10. So that's 2 to the 1,000. That's like 10 to the 300. That's bigger than that's vastly more than all the numbers of atoms in the universe, which is estimated to be 10 to the 80th. So it scales very, very badly. So it means practically this IIT can be explicitly computed only for a small number of neurons, like 5, 8, 10, 11, 12, but then you're hitting really the feasibility. So the work people are trying to do now is to use various approximations to try to see, can you use various approximation to extend the range over which you can compute this. But this is just a practical problem. I mean, similar to the problem that physics faced before the advent of computers. You know, when all you had was a slide rule, your ability to calculate anything was extremely limited, right? But that didn't make physics wrong. It just made physics, well, it's very difficult to explicitly compute things beyond, let's say, the hydrogen atom, you know, or maybe a helium atom, something like that. Now, of course, with computers, we have access to vastly larger computation. Same thing it's going to be with integrated information theory.
But if consciousness is simply subjective experience, then how can it be any more than just present or not? Or does phi include a component of computation? I mean, you point out the difference between information computation and experience-based decision making. What is the difference between those two? And
wait. So it doesn't have to do anything with computation. Yeah, you can of course simulate a brain on a computer, and then you can say it's computing. It's perfectly fine. But the brain just goes through the natural causal laws of biophysics, right? In that sense, it doesn't compute. You can think of it as computation, but I don't think that's in this case particularly useful. Phi itself, as I said, the Greek letter phi, this integrated information, that's just a number, Johnny. You can think of it best, as I said, as either the irreducibility of the system or the quantity of consciousness. Let's say 42, for the sake of argument. 42 doesn't, of course, the number 42 just tells you the system is irreducible to a certain extent, more so than if the system had phi of 41, and less so than if the phi was 43. But it doesn't tell you, is this thing in pain, or does the system feel bored? As I said, in order to do that, you have to unfold, you have a system, this particular brain in a dish, where some neurons are on and other neurons are off, and you have to unfold, or you have to know the complete system and understand its causal mechanism, its causal interaction. And then in principle, you can unfold all these causal interaction at this moment that might happen. And that will exhaustively describe the state of its conscious state of that particular system.
When you talked about the quantity of consciousness, I'm struggling here because I feel that consciousness, the sort of the Nagel definition of what it is to be something, I don't understand quality. How that could have a higher or a lower quantity.
Well, think about when you were a very young child, okay? You didn't know, or let's say just a young child, 3 years old, okay? Let's say you can begin to talk, right? You didn't know about art, you didn't know about sex, you didn't know about rock and roll, right? All those things that now form part of sort of the background, or sometimes can even intrude in your conscious experience. So a simpler brain, like a brain of a young child, particularly that has much less experience about the world, has less integrated information, because many of the neurons, so we even know that in young children, the connection to the front of the brain that might represent these higher order aspects, right, aren't even well formed yet. So if you take one brain and you look its developmental trajectory, I would submit that your conscious, even your quantity, let alone the quality of consciousness, waxes and wanes over lifetime. And a simpler brain, let's say a mouse brain, my dog. Okay, I have a Bernese Mountain Dog. Okay, wonderful creatures. Okay, certainly conscious, but my dog doesn't know about the weekend. It doesn't know about stock market. It doesn't know about politics. None of that, right? So its experience is much simpler than my experience. And my experience now as a fully grown adult is much more complicated than my experience when Christof was a year old. So in that sense, yes, it can be larger, and it probably even across people, right? If we had just like an IQ meter, if we had a conscious meter, a qualia meter, we can probably record, yes, that different people have different, we don't like to think about it because we all think we're the same. But of course, in detail, we know that isn't the case.
Mm-mm-mm. Now, information theory, which you mentioned there, has been very, very useful also in physics to sort of bridge the differences between matter and energy. What do you think of the strengths and limitations of the information analogy in consciousness studies?
Yeah, so there is this, as I mentioned early on, Freddie, the dominant belief in much of neuroscience and certainly throughout tech, big tech, is in what's called computational functionalism, i.e., that consciousness, well, that you can look at complex systems like brains, human brains or any brain, and you can fully understand and analyze them using functionalism. Particular functionalism is instantiated as implemented onto computers, onto Turing machines, right? Universal computers. So the belief is that if I can simulate a human brain, either directly by simulating its biophysics, or more indirectly using deep neural network, things like pre-trained transformer, generalized pre-trained transformer networks, like in ChatGPT. If I do this correctly, and that's just a question of, well, I have included every latest hack. If I can simulate a human, let's say human language, to be concrete about talking about LLMs, then everything that goes hand in hand with that will also be simulated. So then, by definition, once I have this LLM that is as fluid as you and I, then of course it would be conscious. How could it be otherwise? Because we know there's no woo-woo stuff. We know there's no soul-like stuff attached to the human brain. Of course it's going to be conscious. That's sort of the dominant idea. But there we confound intelligence that has a function with consciousness that may or may not have a function. And just because you can simulate a B, just because you can simulate a system doesn't mean you get all the causal powers of a system. So the example I always like to cite is every good astronomer can simulate using Einstein 10-dimensional field equation. You can simulate the black hole at the center of our galaxy, okay, at sigma Sagittarius A star, right? You can turn on the simulation that now simulates this massive 4 million solar masses large object at the center of the galaxy that's so heavy that nothing can escape from it, including light. But funnily enough, you don't have to be afraid that if you turn on, you're going to be sucked into your computer simulation. People say, well, that's stupid. Well, wait, if I simulate everything, then why don't I also simulate gravity? Because just because you write down the equation, you do not get the causal properties of mass to bend space-time. For that, you actually need mass. You need a lot of it. You need 4 million solar masses. Same thing with consciousness. Just because you can simulate the behavior associated with consciousness doesn't mean the system is conscious, because you don't give it the causal power of the human brain.
Even if I build an artificial connectome that maps neuron for neuron?
Well, so it's a very good question. So now we have to get into the details. It depends how you build it. If you have a gigantic digital computers like they exist today, in the cloud, no, because you can actually, a different way you could answer that, you could have answered my critique as saying, well, wait, but transistors connected to other transistors has some amount of causal power, which is true. But now if you actually analyze, and we've done this in a technical manuscript that's on bioRxiv, if you actually look at the the networks that are underlying von Neumann machines, where typically you have one transistor connected to 3 to 4 other transistors and getting input to 3 or 4 other transistors. Compare that to the networks in the brain, where you have one pyramidal cell, sort of the pyramidal cell is the working horse of the brain, of mammalian brain, that gets input from, let's say, 50,000 or 80,000 other pyramidal cells and projects to 50 or 80,000 other pyramidal cells, vastly different. So it turns out it matters how a function is accomplished matters. It matters for consciousness. So in principle, you can take 2 boxes. You wire them up with input-output. One, you have a human brain, or you have a brain that comes together with consciousness. In the other case, you have a perfect simulacrum of the brain. Okay, perfect digital running in the cloud on a von Neumann machine. Both have the same input-output, and you can show this rigorously. One will have consciousness, the other one not, because it's not just an input-output transformation. That may be true for language, which you can think of as a symbolic manipulation. I say something, and then you say something, and you can think of that as a functional transformation. But that's not true for consciousness, as John Searle already argued 30 years ago with his Chinese room argument.
So what about the cognition component? In this series, listeners, we spoke to Evan Thompson, the philosopher, about the embodied cognition movement, if you want to deep dive into this mind in life question. And inevitably, we ended up thinking about the boundaries between subjective selves and the idea of extended cognition spreading out from the person's brain to include their bodies, their technologies, the environment that they're constantly interacting with, and also the collective mind of the society that they're a part of. And I really like this extended cognition analogy for how ourselves are contained by our bodies and our schemas, but our minds are far more unified with those elements of the world around us. How do you and IIT deal with this apparent duality between separateness and connectedness, and with the boundaries between selves, Christof? Because I guess it's going to be quite important when we get on to mystical experiences and psychedelics in a moment.
Well, so first of all, I can do the following experiment that has been done many times, of course. If I have seizures, massive seizures, the neurosurgeon still done today can do a radical commissurotomy where they cut the 200 million fibers that link my right brain to my left brain. Okay, this is called a split brain procedure. And as we know, in fact, a Nobel Prize was assigned to that. Then what do we observe with respect to consciousness? Well, of course, famously, typically it's only the left hemisphere that speaks. The right one cannot speak. But as far as we know, the right one is also conscious. It just can't speak. But if you silence the left one by injecting, for example, sodium amytal, a short-acting barbiturate, the right one can answer simple yes/no question. It can sing. It can do lots of complicated computation. But the interesting point is here that from the point of view of the right hemisphere or the left hemisphere, the other mind, although it's in the same skull, may as well be on the dark side of the moon. It has no direct experience of it. Right? So here you have 2 half brains now, 2 cortical hemispheres that are inside one skull, but they don't experience each other. They're 2 separate, very distinct. Okay. So now you can imagine, and IIT has done this, you can do sort of the inverse as a thought experiment. So I take wires. Let's say I take a fancy brain-machine interface technology, let's say like Neuralinks, the Neuralink company of Elon Musk. And I put wires between, let's say, my visual brain and your visual brain, bidirectional. So now you can begin to see what I see through my eyes, and you can begin to see what you see through your eyes. Like an augmented reality. But I'm still me, and you're still you. IIT predicts that will be the case, that I'm still me and you're still you, until the integrated information across our 2 brains exceeds the integrated information in my brain and in your brain by itself. At that point, abruptly, Freddy will disappear. Consciousness, Christof will disappear. Instead, there will be this new Ubermind, this new amalgamation of Freddy Christof that will be one conscious mind in 2 brains that has two mouths, 4 legs, 4 arms, etc. It will be a single conscious entity. So what I'm trying to point at, that IIT has some very precise notion of what is included in the current definition of the whole. WHOLE, the whole. The whole is what is that is what is conscious. It can extend. Yeah, if I go, if I spend a weekend skiing, and I have a ski pole, my whole sort of extends to representation of the pole, right? Because you can have this intuitive feeling. You feel like you're touching the ground with your ski pole, right? So you can have these extensions. So it can, because our brain is plastic, the brain can be amenable to change the boundaries between self and the rest of the world, including others. But normally, right now, for instance, you are you and I'm me. And even though we interact, there's no evidence that there's an uber consciousness.
And this brings us on to these levels of cellular cognition that I just wanted to get your take on before we get on to psychedelics and mystical experience, and particularly to the implications of Michael Levin's work. And he described to me the various levels of complexity of cognition, from the very smallest single cell swimming towards food in a petri dish, but swimming away from a toxin. And that there's just no reason to believe that that isn't some very simple form of cognitive experience there. And we might call that proto-consciousness, if you like. And then he described...
I call it consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. And he described more and more complex unities of cells combining together using gap junctions into single selves that operate as one with their own goals and their own simple cognitive processes, with structures getting more and more complex, with higher functional, building up to skin, to bone, up to organs like livers and eyeballs, and eventually to brains, right up to the contained unit of the body itself with its single associated cognitive experience. And Michael suggested that at each level of unity and function, there was a different self experiencing cognitively with its own needs, with its own goals, with its own agency. And that those subselves, if you like, aren't perceived by the larger self that contains them, maybe because they appear to be controlled by that unified creature. How does IIT account for the agency of subsystems of ever smaller cognitive experience in biological creatures? And do you think that this approach might help us rethink the nature of experience, or is it a mistake to associate cognition with experience?
Well, there's no... So I'm personally, I believe that consciousness may extend throughout the tree of life, and even single bacteria or protozoa. If you look at the complexity of the molecular interactions, even in a single cell ammoeba, there are probably a couple of thousand different proteins. There are probably, maybe close to a billion different protein molecules in there. So it's vast, untapped complexity. So it may well feel like an itsy bit like something. The protozoa isn't going to think about the weekend or about boredom, but it may feel like something. And when it dies, when its cellular walls dissolve, then, it ceases to have an experience. So I have no problem with that. In fact, that's my belief. So I sort of, following Eva Thompson, I sort of think that consciousness and life may, to a large extent, be coextensive. However, certainly per IIT is very clear on this. For anyone, there's no causal overlap. So let's say when we talk about consciousness in me, there is this conscious substrate, let's see, which includes much of the posterior part of cortex, but there aren't subsets of neurons that are separately consciousness. And at least as long, not in that particular brain, because then you would get causal overlap, and you get into difficulty with counting things twice over. So yes, if you have different organisms that have different size, no problem that consciousness can be found in very small substrate or in very large substrates. Again, this relates to this integrated information phi. If it's very small, a single cell, it may only have a phi of 0.2, and in us it may be a trillion, right? But for any particular conscious system, there are no suprasystems that are conscious, nor are there subsystems. In this thought experiment, when we start merging our brains, there wouldn't be this uber consciousness of Freddy, Christof, as well as you or I. There's only one. Either it's you and I separately, or it's you and I together, but then without the individual ones. IIT is very clear on this, rightly or wrongly. it says that's not possible.
Amazing stuff, Christof. Thank you so much for all this detail. So at last, we have the full arc of your career to set the scene for your arrival to psychedelics quite late in life that led to the title of your new book. Beautiful title, Then I Am Myself the World, a quote from Wagner's opera Tristan and Isolde. And one of the themes of the book is those rare experiences when consciousness is expanded. It can happen during mystical experiences, religious experiences, but also during meditation, psychedelic, and even near-death experiences. And you felt, as you mentioned quite rightly, the obligation as a lifelong student of consciousness to learn more. And knowing it was famous for inducing these non-dual experiences of ego dissolution, you chose 5-MeO-DMT as a method to access that state. Can you do your best to try and put that experience into words?
Yeah, so I had two profound experiences. One is the mystical experience, and one is an NDE, and near-death experiences. So the NDE happened in the first week of COVID, and you inhale something, and within 10 seconds, the visual field starts fractioning, and turns black into this black hexagonal, and you dive down into this hole, into this black hole, and then everything disappears. In a sense that the body is gone, the sense of self is gone, passage of time is gone, so the moment doesn't feel too long or too short, it simply is. There's no sound, there's no smells, there's no pain, there's no pleasure. In my case, there were three things. There was a bright light of overwhelming intensity. Some people interpret it as a light at the end of the tunnel, but there was no tunnel. There was just this bright light. And then there was this god-awful terror and ecstasy, this combination of terror and ecstasy. And both lasted, they lasted. There wasn't any duration to this. Later on, I discovered when I came through, it was sort of about 10 minutes, this experience. This is a rather intense experience. And, I think about it every day. And it's taught me a few things. It's taught me, A, that I was always correct in assuming that you see, in this moment, there was no self, there was no Christof, there wasn't, a reduced sense of Christof. There was just nothing. I wasn't a man or woman or child or God or an animal or rock. That just wasn't there. And there was no external world. I wasn't dimly aware. There was just nothing except this pain and the ecstasy and this bright light. And so it taught me that self is optional. And it left me very confused, in a sense. How could I explain that? What sort of extreme state had I entered? And how could that be explained by neuroscience? And people are trying to do experiments using this substance, and this is not an uncommon experience that I had. One of the great beneficial side effects was, as I discovered a few weeks later, that I totally lost, due to this experience, my fear of death. So, like many of us, as you get older, you sleep less well, and you lie in bed, and you think what happens after you're dead, and living forever and ever and ever. You look down, like it's like climbing in the mountains, and you're looking down at this canyon. But it goes down. It's just like this existential canyon that goes down forever into infinity, and you get sort of existential nausea, existential dread. And all of that has been totally, and it's still true 5 years later, has been totally wiped out. So the other thing I discovered, so there was a long-term beneficial effect, that ultimately in that world, in that moment, the world had disappeared, and the only thing there was just this experience, close to what some people call pure experience. It wasn't totally pure because I had this sense of terror and ecstasy. again, which if you read the mystical literature, is not uncommon. In fact, this a famous, what's his name, a German theologian talks about the tremendum mysterium. Or if you think about the etymology of the word awful in English, full of awe, it comes from that. Experience something completely overwhelming where you get both terror and ecstasy. So that was my near-death experience.
In the book, you talk about the dissolution of self and the knower merging with the known. But the big question for me is that if there's no more self, no more time, no more separation from everything, what being is actually experiencing in that moment?
Well, so I had a second experience that was, years later, a year and a half ago, way past midnight on a beach in Brazil, where I had a more classical mystical experience, in a sense where I became, I lost myself, a sense of self. I lost my body. I lost any representation of the environment, and I felt myself flowing out in becoming part of the plenum. I mean, my plenum was filled with stars. There was nothing but stars. So I felt, and thus the title of the book, then I myself the world. I experienced becoming identical to the universe. Now I know that sounds totally woo-woo, but that was my experience, right? And so the challenge is to, as a thinking person and a scientist, to try to reconcile what does it mean, this experience? What do I take home from it? What does that tell me about the biophysics, about the metaphysics of what exists? And one classical interpretation of such mystical experiences, of course, of idealism, that what truly exists is only the mental, and somehow on the beach at midnight under the southern sky, I tapped into whatever was there of my conscious, tapped into and became one with this whole. Now that's not amenable to scientific empirical verification, but it's certainly compatible with what I experienced. So I became part of the whole for a brief moment.
So what are the common neurobiological components between experiences like that, very similar, reported in meditation, mystical experiences, near-death, religious experiences? Is the reported lowering of activity in the default mode network during these experiences relevant to this type of blurring of the boundary between self and other?
Probably. So we know still very little. People haven't done any single cell recordings in humans. It's mainly, most of the research is done in mice, which is totally unclear whether mice have any sort of experience like humans do. In humans, as you point out, they've done EEG experiments, and some imaging experiments seem to indicate lowering, as you again said, in parts of the brain along the cingulate, particularly the posterior cingulate, that go hand in hand with this default network that represents some notion of self. That's certainly compatible with that. How that would explain this is, at this point, completely unclear. It's still very early on in the science of psychedelics. But that seems to be the common denominator, that you seem to get a reduction in activity. You get less of this high frequency activity, gamma range activity that's characteristic of everyday thought. And you get a shifting towards lower frequency, although some people have these incredible elaborate near-death experience where they visit, they encounter, they relive critical memories of their lifetime, they encounter some sort of spiritual messenger. So how that would be compatible, I'm not quite sure. But again, we haven't done a lot of imaging. If you've ever been in a magnetic scanner, it's not a good place to be in if you're on mushrooms or 5-MeO DMT, and we all know setting matters a great deal. So it's at this stage, the honest answer is we don't know. We're still groping very much groping for answers. The experience is whatever the experience is, no matter what its physical neuronal substrate is.
And to take these implications of these psychedelic experiences seriously, IIT style, I assume we have to consider if they have causal power in the real world. I mean, they certainly cause real transformation, as you just mentioned, about the fear of death, which is very, very common. So how real are these psychedelic experiences, Christof?
As real as anything else in your life. No, literally. I mean, if you had a toothache last night, I'm not going to deny that this is for you. When you have a bad enough pain, it is more real than anything else. And of course, we know from from many types of psychedelics or meditation that these experiences can be more real than real, where you feel, finally, I've come to the heart of the universe. Finally, I'm really there. Finally, I find myself at home in the universe, finally, after, having lived 65 years, right? It's a very common experience. And you bring back, to use beautiful language of William James, the father of American psychology, with this noetic quality, right? He talks about in his book, The Variety of Religious Experience. People bring back this knowledge by acquaintance that no one else has to accept. You don't have to accept it if you didn't have this experience. But for me, there's no doubt. I have had this experience. It is more real than anything else. Anything else is sort of vague and indistinct compared to this type of experience.
And that's fine. And we've got, very, very common, even among skeptics, this mystical experience where you feel identity with all things. But then we've got the entities that you mentioned now, particularly common in near-death experiences and in DMT experiences, where we have extremely interactive entities coming into the consciousness whilst your body is completely inactive, often with messages, often completely otherworldly creatures. We've got a whole episode on DMT entities in this series. Extraordinary phenomenology. You're saying they're real. Where are these characters being summoned from? Are they out of our imagination? Are they from the collective unconscious? And how real are their messages?
Well, I mean, so it again depends what you mean by real. And we also have to distinguish. I know in DMT people have these encounters, and I don't doubt that they have had these encounters. Just like you can really dream pretty weird stuff, right? What is the metaphysical implication of that? Are they truly accessing another world that's common to all, like a common collective form of unconsciousness, as many people believe? I don't know. I've never had such an experience, so I can't give you any first-hand account of it. Maybe if I would have, I can be more concrete, but since I've never had an experience of that nature, I don't know. I simply don't know. I'm willing to say often, I simply don't know.
And has this shifted your approach to the nature of reality? Has it shifted your approach to IIT?
Well, so IIT, once again, is not idealist. IIT assumes consciousness is more real than anything else, but there is a physical substrate. And it requires a physical substrate for me to have an experience. For me to have had that experience on the beach, under a southern sky, required a substrate, presumably in the brain. Period. What's happened to me, that experience, again, I think about it every day because it questioned it shifted the tectonic planes of my metaphysical understanding, which at my age, I'm now 67, is not so common anymore, because I always believed, I never was particularly impressed by idealism because, I believe either it's a physicalist or it's a dualist view that I've had. But now I find more and more that challenged by, well, maybe idealism is right. Maybe Schopenhauer, my favorite go-to Arthur Schopenhauer, idealist of the 19th century, who has expressed this very cohesive thoughts about the matter. maybe they're right. Maybe ultimately what truly exists is the phenomenal that expresses itself in the laws of physics and in evolution and in biology. But ultimately, what truly exists is phenomenal. And if true, that would mean, well, you can still be a scientist like I am. I mean, I'm still a card-carrying scientist. I still go to the lab and do experiments. But it doesn't, because if science is the single most powerful technique humans have invented to manipulate the environment, for better or worse. I would say immediately, right? For better or worse. But it is a technique like if you want to build a vaccine, if you want to build quantum computers, if you want to go to Mars, you better use science and its offspring technology. And it'll work, right?
As Kastrup points out, if everything exists in mind, that doesn't change anything about science and about the laws of nature.
Exactly. So
it
science
doesn't
still
hold
works.
us back.
Exactly. Still works. So it's just the metaphysical underpinning of it shouldn't be taken so seriously. So science claimed this is the only thing that truly exists, matter and associated stuff. Well, that's a metaphysical assumption. Forget about that. Science is very good. You observe this and you manipulate that and you get that. It works spectacularly well. But don't take its metaphysical underpinnings too serious. Just use it as an instrumental, as a practical tool to manipulate the world in ways that are beneficial to us and hopefully to the planet.
Stay away from isms in general. That would be my take. The reason I ask about that shift.
I agree. But on the other hand, if you're a questioning person, you want to know what truly exists. You cannot help yourself, think about, well, what does truly exist? What is real? So yes, some people say stay away from ism, but that doesn't solve this scratch that many of us have to understand our place in the universe.
You said very wisely, Christof, maybe the questions are more useful than the potential answers. So The reason I ask is about my last question about this shift. My last question is about plant cognition and plant intelligence and plant memory, which obviously don't have brains. Now, if we assume that life is essential for mind, then we should consider the possibility that flora are also experiencing as well as fauna. And the recent research into plant memory and communication from Monica Galliano, fantastic show on that, listeners, you must check out, is showing that they may be far more intelligent than we previously assumed, capable even of associative Pavlovian memory, as she proved. This idea comes across well when we find these molecules like DMT and psilocybin growing naturally in our food chain. And in fact, there is a long shamanic tradition that reports plant entity consciousness and communication. You've tried it. What's your take on eco-consciousness and plant consciousness now, Christof?
It's possible. For me, however, the question is at what scale? So if I look at a tree, for instance, okay, I live here in the Pacific Northwest. You can go to the coastal range, fantastic cedar trees, gigantic, and you wonder about, are they sentient? And I in principle have no trouble believing in that possibility. However, the question is, so per IIT, it's all about the local interactions. And what characterizes brains is that you have these very long-term connections where brain here, where a cell here can extend its tendril and have causal interaction with neurons that are very, very far away. This is what gives it its powers. In trees, etc., I don't see that. I see these local. You don't have anything as complex as neurons. The complexity is much simpler. So I wonder. It's one question. Maybe individual cells are conscious, but is the tree as a whole conscious? I don't know. I simply don't know enough about plant physiology and plant anatomy to be able to give an educated opinion.
But after your experience, the idea that Mother Ayahuasca or, any of these particular plant entities may be real? Is it on the cards, or are you just trying not to think about it?
I try to focus on things that are, for me at least, a little bit more accessible.
At least accessible in quotidian reality when the default mode network is in charge.
Yes.
Exactly. Christof Koch, it leaves me only to thank you with all my heart, and I will say with my heart, thank you for your time, and thank you from the listeners as well. Christof Koch.
Thank you, Freddy. That was enjoyable, very engaged. I like that.